Okay, I want to take just a few minutes to talk about this, what we're doing here. This particular event is particularly interesting to my daughter Avery, so I want to spend a few minutes talking about it. We're expanding the garden, so we're digging up the grass. We're going to put some vegetables in here, okay? But what we've done is I've tried to dig up the grass to the point where I dig up the roots as well, okay? And so what I've done is I've taken the grass that I dug up there and I've transferred it over here to an area where I dug up all these undesirable weeds that I don't want anymore, and I've transplanted the grass. Water it in real good, mash it down, let the roots get established, and this grass can grow. As long as it's getting plenty of sunshine and it's getting watered, this grass will continue to grow. So you can actually transplant certain types of organisms, certain types of plants from one area to another if you maintain the root system and if you keep the integrity of the plant intact. So just an interesting subject. I don't know if you knew that was possible. My daughter didn't. So okay, now we're going to talk for a little bit about the details of photosynthesis. So I just want to quickly remind you of the formula again. Remember, it involves 6 molecules of carbon dioxide being taken in, along with 6 molecules of water being taken in, along with some sunlight. Chemical reaction occurs, bonds get broken, get rearranged to form 1 molecule of glucose and 6 molecules of oxygen gas. So let's take a look at our chloroplast and see how this takes place. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to divide the process into 2 halves of the process. And it doesn't work like this in the actual chloroplast. Actually, it's going on in all of the chloroplast all of the time, but it's easier to talk about it if we split it up. Okay, so we're going to break this down into the light dependent reactions. Okay, we'll talk about those first. So, and then after that, we will talk about the light independent. And I'm not going to write that whole word out. It takes too long. Light independent reactions. Okay, and there's 2 halves of this process. There's kind of 2 main parts to the chlorophyll, or to the chloroplast, excuse me. And so that's why we learned those names. So here's how it works. Let's start off with the light dependent reactions. In the light dependent reactions, okay, like the name implies, these reactions depend on light, okay? And so when we look at our overall equation of photosynthesis, we got to have light. We know plants have to have light. The pigment, the chlorophyll, is going to do the job of absorbing the light. So in the light dependent reactions, in comes the light. Okay, so there's light. And again, usually that's going to be sunlight, but of course we can grow plants with artificial light and that kind of thing as well. Okay, so in comes the light. Now when that happens, all right, the plant has, remember, already taken in some water. Okay, so let's go ahead and get our water into our thylakoid. Here's our water, H2O. Okay, and after taking in a couple of those water molecules, that light, those photons and all the energy associated with it, split the water molecule into hydrogens and oxygen atoms. And so immediately what happens is 2 of those oxygen atoms get together and form oxygen gas. Okay? So if we look at our general equation for photosynthesis over here, we've already knocked out half of it. Okay? We got light, we had water absorbed by the leaf, by the plant, into the chloroplast where it could be used, and the light split the water into oxygen. So we've already taken care of those couple of components. Now, there's a whole lot of details here that I'm going to leave out for the sake of simplicity. Okay, but what happened over here? Where'd the hydrogen go? Okay, we split the water, we turned it into oxygen over here, but where'd the hydrogen go? Well, long story short, they form a type of energy-bearing molecule called NADPH. And the H, essentially, is the hydrogens that were the part of the water. Okay? Now, also in this reaction over here in the thylakoids, also what forms is a couple of our old buddy ATP molecules. Okay? Now, again, there's plenty of details I'm gonna leave out in the interest of time and simplicity, but the long story short is these are both molecules that provide energy for the next half of what's going on, okay? So the next half of what's going on, remember, the light dependent reactions take place in the thylakoid, in the membranes of the thylakoid actually, okay? What takes place next is going to take place outside the thylakoids in that area that we defined as the stroma, okay? And what happens in the, let's see what color I can use here. What happens in the stroma is a process called the Calvin cycle, named after a gentleman named Melvin Calvin. Yes, his mama named him Melvin Calvin. Okay. But Melvin Calvin is responsible for discovering this particular part of the process. Very complex set of reactions that take place here. But ultimately what happens in this process is, this is where carbon dioxide jumps into the equation. So here's our CO2 that we need, okay? And then that ATP and that NADPH that we made over here in the light reactions, those get used in the Calvin cycle to synthesize. Remember, this is photosynthesis. What are we synthesizing? Ultimately, we are synthesizing the all-important glucose molecule. Okay? Now, also in the Calvin cycle, you can't forget, it's called a cycle, so it has to be able to regenerate itself. How does it regenerate itself? Well, it does so by breaking ATP back down into ADP. Remember, we talked about that cycle in the last video. Go back and review that one. ADP plus that inorganic phosphate group, okay? And that NADPH, it unloaded its hydrogens. There they are, okay? It unloads its hydrogens and returns itself to NADP plus, which is now able to accept hydrogens once the water gets split, once we do this all over again in the thylakoid membranes, okay? So you got light, come back around over here. Let's review from up here. Summary, we got light dependent reactions. They depend on the light. Oh, I forgot to mark off, well, we'll do it in a second. They depend on the light, so they take the light, they take the water, they split it into oxygen, they donate those hydrogens to NADPH along with ATP. They get donated to the Calvin cycle, okay, which takes place in the stroma. Over in the Calvin cycle, this is where CO2 enters the equation. We use the energy of NADPH, the energy of ATP. All this is in that PowerPoint. Go back and take a look at it, okay, to make the all-important glucose molecule. So if we go back and review our equation, okay, we've got in the light reactions, we got light, water, and oxygen. In the, sometimes referred to as the dark reactions, but they don't happen in the dark, they happen in the light as well. They just don't require light. The light independent reactions, we take CO2 and we end up with glucose. And you can check my math, 6 C's over here, 6 C's over here, 12 hydrogens over here, 12 hydrogens over here. A total of, let's see, 18 oxygens there. Total of 18 oxygens there. Biochemistry, it's a beautiful thing. All right, again, go back and review. I'll put in additional assignments in classroom, some worksheet style stuff for you guys to have a look at. But remember, it's all about energy transformation. Energy is getting transformed. We're going to use ATP in the next section when we get into the details of cellular respiration. Okay, and the materials get recycled. Energy one way, matter recycled. All right, we'll see you guys next time.